Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our third and final section of today's notes. So, we're going to continue looking at the Soviet invasion a little bit, but our primary focus today will be the Holocaust in North Africa. So, the Nazi New Order. Hitler and the Nazis had planned on winning the war, so they established what they called the General Plan for the East. This was the warrant for what is known as ethnic cleansing. It demanded the elimination of people currently living in the East. This included the Poles, Ukrainians, obviously the Russians, and other groups as well. Most would be sent to less desirable areas and allowed to die of starvation and disease, with a small percentage being kept as laborers. Basically, also within this, that all Jewish people would then simply disappear altogether. It's important to note that this report is full of euphemisms. Instead of saying killing, it said things like reducing or removing them. And the intentions were very much obvious. The fact that a lot of people were going to die. So this leads into Germanization. We've talked about this before, making yourself more German. This called for this general plan, a Germanization of vast territory. It's important to note that they also wanted to, massively expand the population. So, in order to do this, they kidnapped racially valuable children and raised them as Germans. To provide you with some statistics, about 50% of Czech children were suitable for the process, and about 75% of children from places like Belarus were also deemed acceptable. Some would be kidnapped under the Hay operation that kidnapped thousands from Eastern Europe and sent them to the Reich. Some being raised by families, and others being sent to the factories to work. As this is going on in the camps, experimentation by Nazi doctors with methods of sterilization are going to continue. It's also important to note that schemes like this reveal an instability in the Nazi notions of race and blood, because they're taking people that are not German and making them German, but they don't have any German blood. See the point there? It kind of goes against that whole ideology that they were working with. In the Soviet Union, Germans are going to take over whatever industrial production they can get their hands on that had been left behind by the Soviets. They also took any agricultural goods that were produced in the areas they controlled and utilized hunger as a weapon. So, talking about that, it's directly tied into Nazi policy. It's intended to keep food supplies and morale up on the home front and for soldiers. It becomes a weapon of mass murder. It causes a massive social breakdown. It killed about 500,000 Jews in the ghettos and killed at least 1 million Soviet citizens as well during this process. Now, they did this by cutting off food to major cities like Kiev and Leningrad, with people like Elena Kozhina talking about their experience fleeing from Leningrad and the hunger that came with it. So, in her words, indeed, the train stopped sometimes for an hour, sometimes for a day. Nobody knew where it was headed, when, and how long it would stop. Sometimes it stopped in the middle of empty fields or naked, leafless forests. Sometimes it stopped at a junction full of military echelons and other trains carrying coal. There it would be met by women with knapsacks of bread, eggs, and boiled potatoes. Salted pickles, excuse me. They sold them unwillingly, often bartering them for the Leningraders' belongings. Mama desperately tried to buy anything we asked for. We were me and my 3-year-old sister Tanya. Grandma never asked for anything. She was already very weak and spoke little. So, what do you think of when hearing about Elena's experience? Take a couple minutes, discuss with your table partners, and then we will talk about it as a class. So, another big part of this is the anti-partisan warfare. This creates a pretty deadly spiral in the Balkans, and in order to not call it resistance fighters, they refer to it as banditry. And their fear of the partisans justified draconian measures. Anybody that was suspected of partisan activity could be executed, their family killed, and their village burned to the ground. Public executions and hangings were extremely common, and this served a major dual purpose: to terrorize the population and serve as a show of strength back home to the German home front. Now, one of the big things we have to talk about is the city of Stalingrad. A vast majority of Jews that were killed during this period were killed outside of Germany. 95% of those killed during the Holocaust were not German citizens to begin with. Now, this would not have happened without military conquests. And at least at this point, many of the Allies did not see that link between the two. So it's important to note, and this is where we touch back into the Soviet invasion for a minute. In December 1941, the Red Army stops the German advance, but it does start again in spring 1942. This is where we get into the Battle of Stalingrad, which starts in late summer of 1942 and continues until January 31st, 1943, when the German contingent in the south part of the city, led by Paulus, surrenders. And then a few days later, the northern contingent will surrender as well, with about 90,000 German POWs taken and hundreds of thousands dead. It's important to note, though, that many civilians will help in the defense of the city, and this also serves as a major turning point for the war. I'm going to reposition my bubble real quick because I really do like this graphic, and I do want to go over this. So, in whole, we had about 2 million, over 2 million soldiers in this battle, with about 24 hours being the average lifespan of soldiers. Once we got to winter, the average temperature was negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 30 degrees Celsius, if you prefer that model. In terms of casualties, we're looking at a total casualty count of 1.9 million people, 1.1 million Red Army casualties, 40,000 civilians, and about 800,000 Axis soldiers as well. So the impact on the German home front is interesting. The defeat at Stalingrad was presented to the public, I should say, as a strategic retreat. Few were fooled by this. And discontent did not turn into open opposition. Most went about their daily routines, becoming more cynical and withdrawn from the war effort. In order to keep people happy, the Nazis reduced restrictions on churches to traditional religion and lessened its campaign on being against cigarette smoking, which I think is really weird. Think about it. We're talking about the Nazi Party. They're actively campaigning against smoking. That's pretty weird. It's not something you would normally consider a fascist dictator's party to, be advocating for. It's also important to know most people on the home front knew about the mass murders that were being committed, and German leaders were worried about critics at home, making crimes like presenting defeatism that they were going to be defeated an offense punishable by death. Some more impact. The definition being defined as Aryan did protect many Germans. They were allowed to keep their religions, even though people like Himmler viewed Christianity as an offshoot of Judaism and wanted it gone. But they were hesitant to do anything about this because it would deprive the public of the comfort of traditional religion, which they did not want to do. On the front lines, desertion and self-mutilation were not uncommon in the East, with mental breakdowns also resulting in transfers to less trying duties. It's also important to know, at this point, Hitler bribed many of his top officials. Every month, generals would receive 2,000 to 4,000 Reichsmarks, and if they reached a major anniversary, like their 50th birthday or something, they could be given up to 250,000 Reichsmarks. That's a lot of money. It's also important to look at the impact of Stalingrad on the situation of Jews. It didn't improve the immediate situation, but it did help break the myth of German invincibility. It also changed the dynamic between the Nazis and the Axis powers. Places like Romania and Hungary held on to portions of their Jewish populations to use as bargaining chips with the Allies. Now, this also occurred at the peak of the process of annihilating the Jews. To put this in a timeline, by the time we're finished today, we'll pretty much be in mid to late 1943. So we still got 2 full years of the war left, but it's starting to wind down at this point. So we have to ask ourselves a major question. Why did the Nazis waste manpower and resources on annihilating Jews instead of focusing on the war, like actual warfare? Well, they saw it as part of a warfare, and Hitler claimed that Jews were pulling the strings of the Allied war effort. So with this, we have another major massacre to talk about, this being the Harvest Festival, where we'll see 42,000 Jews murdered near Majdanek. So here's a quote from Heinrich Buchholz of the 1st Company Reserve Police Battalion 101. In this, he says, "From my position, I could now observe how the Jews were driven naked from the barracks by other members of our battalion. The shooters of the execution commando sat on the edge of the graves directly in front of me, were members of the SD. Some distance behind each shooter stood several other SD men, who constantly kept the magazines of the submachine guns full and handed them to the shooter. A number of such shooters were assigned to each grave. Today, I can no longer provide details about the number of graves. So, for a minute, I want you all to talk about this with your table partners. How does Buchholz's account help enhance your understanding of this material? So, let's shift to the Middle East and North Africa. The big thing we need to talk about now is it's crucial to look at this in World War II and the Holocaust. And while most traditional histories talk about things like Erwin Rommel, El Alamein, Tunisia, those battles, it does not include the Holocaust or the experience of Jewish people that live in this region. It's often absent because it exists outside the narrative of it being the destruction of European Jews. Now, another major factor of this is it is political. And there are 3 points of emphasis to look at this. There's issues specific to the region that were important in shaping events. Distinguishing the feature of the region was diversity, and the pervasiveness of imperial and colonial systems will also impact this as well. So, starting in the Middle East, we need to talk about the Farhud. This is Iraq in the 1940s, which is home to a Jewish population of about 135,000 people, or about 3% of the population. By spring 1941, the British were losing. And in April 1941, a nationalist coup against the pro-British government is going to happen. At response to this, the British are then going to occupy the region. But before being stopped, those that led the coup are going to kill about 150 to 180 Jewish people. This becomes known as the Farhud, or loosely translating meaning the looting or stealing. It has come to signify the violence against Jews in Baghdad in 1941. In response, hundreds of people were killed to stop the riots. Jews suddenly felt very vulnerable, and people were scared because it violated one of the basic tenets of Islam, which is nonviolence. Along with this, by the 1950s, most Jews that lived in Iraq had left for Israel. Now, moving to North Africa, there's about 500,000 Jews that live there, and they experienced a lot under racial laws from 3 fascist regimes. One of the major ones being Tunisia, which was occupied twice by Germany and Vichy France, and with their thousands there being sent to deadly labor camps. We'll come back to Tunisia in a minute. So, North Africa under Vichy France specifically applied anti-Jewish legislation in Algeria. Places like Tunisia and Morocco not as enthusiastic to support these things, and people like the Sultan Mohammed V in Morocco actually protected Jews by refusing to implement those policies. Tunisia will be hit full force during the German occupation, and the only reason Jews will escape annihilation here is due to the fact of Axis defeat on the North African front. And then Libya is under Italian control. They're going to send their Jews to internment camps. So, let's get into Operation Torch. German setbacks will start in 1942 with Erwin Rommel being defeated at El Alamein and then retreating. As this is going on, Operation Torch will begin. 106,000 Allied troops will land in Morocco and Algeria under the command of General Eisenhower of the United States. Germans are going to be pushed back to Tunisia, and by March 1943, Rommel can't supply his troops. So he requests evacuation, but Hitler says no. So by May 1943, Rommel surrenders at Tunis, and the Allies take 230,000 German POWs. And the effects are felt all over the world. Weirdly enough, Hitler blamed the French for this, so he takes over Vichy France. Completely. They're done. And it also affected the Soviet Union. Defeating the Axis in North Africa made it impossible to open a front in northwestern Europe in 1943. The Soviets were desperate for relief and had been asking for a new front to be open for years. They'd been relentlessly fighting since 1941. However, the Allies instead are going to opt to invade Sicily in 1943 and push the Allied invasion of France to 1944. It's important to understand that millions will be slaughtered by the Germans in Soviet territories in this time. And military developments in North Africa worked out by both sides had little thought for the impact on groups like the Jews, civilians in the Soviet Union and North Africa, and the Italians. So let's look at the impact on Italy. Um, this completed Italy's disillusionment with the Axis when the Allies landed in Sicily in July 1943. Very similarly to Dunkirk, they're going to work to evacuate their forces. About 100,000 will actually be evacuated. With this, Mussolini's regime collapsed. They dissolved the fascist party, and Germany takes control of northern Italy, taking 725,000 Italian POWs, with 615,000 of them being sent to Germany as forced laborers. In Italy, Pietro Badoglio is going to take control and then declare war on Germany. Mussolini will be freed by the Nazis and be put in charge in the north, but he would be killed with his mistress when the war was over. Now, the effects of this on the Jewish population was devastating. Italians tended to be less brutal than their German allies, and many military officials and diplomats would not cooperate with Germany and deport their Jews. So many sought refuge in Italian occupied zones. So most of the Italian Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust died in 1944 and 1945 when most of those Italian occupied regions were controlled by the Nazis. Okay, let's get into our final assessment. You are going to analyze the quote from Benghazi, Bergen, Belsen, and then consider the following questions. The tall soldier aimed his weapon toward one woman's head, announcing angrily that if none of them said at least one word of Yiddish, she would be shot. Frightened sobs filled the air. Silvana rocked her brain to recall the one Yiddish word Rebecca used once in a while. She couldn't come up with it. The soldier shot the woman. The prisoners froze in their tracks. No one said a word until Silvana cried Gewalt. Some people looked at her accusingly. She was too late. Others were paralyzed. The tall soldier smiled with satisfaction and announced in broken English that he was glad, because he thought he might have had it wrong and that perhaps these people weren't even Jewish. So consider the following. What is happening here? What emotions are being portrayed? And how does this connect to what we've been talking about this unit? For the final time today, here were the sources that were utilized in the creation of this lesson. I will see you all next week. Bye.